What's up, family? Today, we're talking about why the science versus religion debate is built on a lie. Most science versus religion arguments don't collapse because science can't hold its ground. They collapse because the fight itself is built on a false premise. Again and again, science is accused of claims it never made, ideas it never asserted, positions it never defended. Not because those claims are hard to refute, but because they're easier to ridicule. Complex theories are reduced to slogans, carefully defined models are flattened into absurd sound bites, and once that reduction happens, the debate is already over because the real argument has been replaced. These accusations are almost always rooted in scientific illiteracy, but they rarely stop there. Illiteracy becomes repetition, repetition becomes confidence, and confidence becomes conviction. Over time, misrepresentation starts to feel like understanding. At that point, the conversation stops being about evidence or explanation. It becomes performative. One side is no longer engaging what science actually says, it's responding to an imagined version of it, a version stripped of nuance, precision, and context. This isn't a disagreement between two ways of knowing. Disagreement requires shared reference points and a willingness to engage the same claims. What's happening here is something else entirely. It's a conversation where one side keeps shadowboxing an imaginary opponent, confidently landing blows, celebrating victory, and never realizing that the real opponent was never even in the ring to begin with. One of the most common tactics in science versus religion debates is the straw man, and it shows up so frequently that it almost deserves its own name, the straw man factory. It usually sounds like this: you believe nothing came from something, or science claims that we all came from soup, or maybe even science says that we all came from monkeys. These statements are presented as if they are summaries of scientific belief. They are not. They're not scientific positions, scientific conclusions, or scientific theories. They are caricatures, simplified distortions created by critics, not claims put forward by scientists. What's important to understand here is that in nearly 100% of cases, no scientist has ever made these claims. You will not find them in textbooks, peer reviewed papers, or serious scientific explanations of cosmology or evolution. These ideas are not being argued against because they were never argued for in the first place. So, where do they come from? They come from assumptions projected onto science, often by people who either do not understand the theories they're criticizing or who need those theories to sound absurd in order to protect something else. Turning a complex, carefully defined scientific model into a cartoon makes it easier to dismiss without engaging its actual content. This is why calling this a disagreement is misleading. Disagreement requires two sides addressing the same claim. What's happening here isn't engagement, it's substitution. Instead of responding to what science actually says, critics swap it out for a weaker, more ridiculous version. They argue against that instead. And because the replacement is easier to knock down, it creates the illusion of victory without ever touching the real argument. Once you recognize this move, it becomes hard to unsee. You start noticing how often science is not being debated, but impersonated, misrepresented in order to be defeated. And that realization alone should make us pause before taking most science versus religion arguments at face value. Another claim that shows up constantly in these conversations goes something like this: science keeps changing, so how can it be trusted? At first glance, that sounds reasonable. Stability feels trustworthy, consistency feels safe. But this argument only works if you quietly assume that science is trying to function the same way that religion does. It isn't. Religion makes absolute claims and then asks people to organize their lives around loyalty to those claims. The expectation is preservation, holding the belief steady, defending it, passing it down unchanged. In that framework, change looks like failure. Science operates on a completely different logic. Science does not begin with conclusions, it begins with questions. It does not offer doctrine, it builds models. And those models are provisional by design. They're meant to be tested, challenged, refined, or discarded as new evidence becomes available. This is a crucial distinction that often gets blurred. Science itself does not make claims. Scientists propose hypotheses and theories, and those ideas are deliberately left open to interrogation. They're not protected by authority. They are validated or overturned by how well they match reality. So when science changes, it's not contradicting itself. It is not admitting it was wrong in the way that critics imply. It is doing exactly what it was built to do, adjusting its understanding to better reflect the world as it actually is. The dishonesty in the science keeps changing argument is subtle but significant. It assumes that science is attempting to offer the same kind of certainty religion does: absolute, final, unquestionable answers. But science is not in the business of certainty, it's in the business of approximation, of getting closer, of reducing error, of refining our models as our tools and observations improve. Judging science by religious standards is a category mistake. It criticizes science for refusing to pretend it knows more than it does, and that refusal, far from being a weakness, is the very reason science actually works. Religion often insists on being treated as an alternative way of knowing, as though faith based belief and empirical investigation occupy the same epistemological ground, as though they are simply two different methods aiming at the same kind of truth. They are not. This doesn't mean religion is meaningless or that it has no social or psychological function. It means that it operates on a fundamentally different logic than science, and pretending otherwise only creates confusion. Religion specializes in preserving conclusions. Its core function has become to safeguard answers, answers about meaning, morality, origin, and destiny, and to pass those answers down with minimal alteration. Stability is not a side effect of religion, it's the point. Science, by contrast, specializes in pursuing understanding. It doesn't exist to protect conclusions, but to stress test them. Its strength lies not in what it claims to know, but in how aggressively it interrogates its own ideas. Because of this difference, religion and science organize themselves very differently. Religion begins with answers and then builds communities, rituals, identities, and moral frameworks around defending and maintaining those answers. Questioning is often permitted only within carefully defined boundaries because too much instability threatens the structure itself. Science, however, begins with questions and builds systems designed to challenge its own assumptions. Hypotheses are proposed precisely so they can be attacked. The goal is not loyalty to an idea, but alignment with reality, even if that means abandoning cherished models. This is why calls for equal footing are misplaced. Equal footing would require equal rules, and science's rules, open to correction, revision, and falsification, are incompatible with how religion maintains coherence and authority. If religion genuinely adopted this posture, if it welcomed disconfirmation, embraced revision, and allowed its core claims to be overturned by evidence, the conflict would largely dissolve. But it can't do that without ceasing to function as religion, at least not in the supernatural sense. And that isn't an insult, it's an observation about how different systems of thought survive, reproduce, and justify themselves. Science believes there is no meaning is another projection. You'll often hear a claim like this: if science says there's no meaning, why even try? And at first glance, it sounds like a philosophical objection, but underneath it, it's just a projection, an assumption that science is offering a worldview in the same way religion does. It isn't. Science doesn't believe there is no meaning. In fact, science doesn't believe anything at all. Belief is not a part of the method. Science is a process, not a philosophy of life. And yet, scientists try anyway. They test ideas against reality. They measure what can be measured. They refine their models when they fail. They spend years, sometimes entire careers, wrestling with uncertainty, ambiguity, and incomplete information, not because they expect guaranteed answers, but because understanding the world we live in is worth the effort. That pursuit alone should challenge the idea that science drains life of purpose. Meaning is not something science hands down. It doesn't arrive as a decree or a doctrine. Meaning emerges through engagement, through curiosity, responsibility, creativity, and the willingness to confront reality as it actually is, not as we might wish it to be. And that kind of meaning is not fragile. It doesn't collapse when a model changes or a theory is refined. It doesn't depend on certainty or protection. It's earned through participation in the world, not withdrawal from it. When all is said and done, the irony at the center of the science versus religion debate is difficult to ignore. Religion presents itself as the great provider of purpose. It provides meaning, direction, and assurance. And yet, in practice, it often accomplishes the opposite, not by intention, but by structure. Meaning is outsourced to authority, purpose is defined elsewhere. The individual's role becomes acceptance, obedience, and preservation rather than exploration or authorship. Agency is narrowed in exchange for certainty. Science, by contrast, offers no prefabricated purpose. It doesn't tell you why you exist or what you must become. It doesn't promise comfort or moral clarity. What it offers instead is something far more demanding and far more empowering. Science invites people to pursue understanding, to remain curious, to take responsibility for what they believe and why they believe it. Where religion often asks people to protect certainty, science invites people to explore uncertainty. Where religion demands belief as a prerequisite, science demands effort, attention, discipline, humility, and persistence. And this is where the irony sharpens. The system that claims to provide purpose often removes the very conditions required to develop it. The system accused of being meaningless consistently produces people willing to devote their lives to understanding the world, improving it, and taking responsibility for their place within it. In that pursuit, in the struggle to know, to test, to refine, to understand, people don't lose purpose. They discover it, not handed down, not protected from challenge, but earned through engagement with reality and ownership of one's own search for meaning. And once that distinction is clear, the conflict stops looking like science versus religion at all. It starts looking like good faith effort versus unearned authority. Thank you for hanging around to the end. What we're doing here isn't a conversation just for the sake of conversation. Science doesn't fail us because it changes. Communities fail us when they don't. The problem in our world isn't that people have stopped thinking, it's that they've lost places where thinking, belonging, and becoming happen together. Bridge City exists because too many people are thinking deeply about life, meaning, and the world we're shaping, and doing it alone. When inherited systems stop making sense, people don't just lose beliefs, they lose orientation, they lose rhythm, they lose a place where effort, curiosity, and care are shared instead of carried alone. That's the gap Bridge City exists to fill. Bridge City is not a belief system, and it's not a debate space. This isn't a space to sit back and consume, and it's not a space to be told what to think. It's a people centered community built around a simple, proven human rhythm. Weekly gatherings followed by ongoing connection. We gather weekly because connection shapes people and people shape communities, and because what we're building requires consistency, not moments. Over time, those connections become community, clubs, teams, shared projects, intentional relationships. Existing as intentional community allows us to create infrastructure, leaders, systems, local campuses capable of sustaining people centric programs and real world impact. Community care, mental health support, housing, food access, youth development, and so much more. Belonging is the foundation, contribution is the fruit, and impact is the outcome. Bridge City is a place where conversation turns into practice, where reflection turns into responsibility, and where community isn't defined by belief, but by participation. If you're looking for a weekly rhythm that sharpens how you think, grounds how you live, and connects you to people who take both seriously, this is that place. If you still care deeply about people, progress, and the kind of world we're shaping, Bridge City is your place. Connect with our global campus today. Introduce yourself, join us for an upcoming Sunday session, and help us build what comes next. This isn't deconstruction as an identity. This is reconstruction as a practice. We exist to connect better, build better, and live better. I'll see you on campus. All right, that's all for today, family. Until next time, keep rising.